everybody. Welcome to the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report. I am your host, Amy Zewe. Today we have joining us an amazing author, Rabbi Reuven Travis. Prior to his career as an educator, Rabbi Travis spent 15 years as a consultant as well as an advertising and marketing executive. There he worked for large Fortune 500 firms such as Georgia Pacific and Ogilvy Mather. He adapted strategic business and marketing plans for a variety of consumer packaged goods and financial services companies. And he then changed his profession and started his career as an educator. In this role, he taught a wide range of classes, including courses on Jewish law, Jewish history, Zionism, the Shoah, Israel advocacy, American history and civics, and African American history. Rabbi Travis earned his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a double major in French literature and political science. He holds an additional master's degree in teaching from Mercer University and a master's degree in Judaic Studies from Spertus College. He received his rabbinic ordination in 2006 from Rabbi Michael J. Boyd, Dean of the Atlanta Mitzion Kollel, after spending 4 years studying with members of the Kollel. In addition to his collaborations with Rabbi Boyd on his 5 books of the Torah, Rabbi Travis has published scholarly works on the Book of Job, the Book of Numbers, and the differences between American and Jewish legal systems. He also authored a series of books about the weekly parasha for parents and educators of children in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. He currently works as a chaplain at the Northside Hospital in Atlanta. And today he's joining us to talk about one of his many books called Finding America in Exodus. And I'm excited about this book and the whole series as we Americans celebrate our semi-quincentennial, our 250 years of liberty as a sovereign nation. Rabbi Travis, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to hear from you, to learn from you, and hopefully have you back as we will continue examining all of these books that you have written about finding America in 2026 as we celebrate our nation's semi-quincentennial. Now, I gave a little bit of a broad bio and background about you, but before we get into discussing the nitty-gritty of the book, because I do have questions, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself? And give us a little bit about the reason why you decided to engage in writing this series, what the need was, and maybe a quick overview of the rest of the books of the series, because we will be going over those in our Red Alert report in the coming months.
Sure. I mean, let me say I think I'm as excited as you are to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on your podcast. The background story, very, very briefly, I worked closely with Rabbi Boyd on a number of projects. We were neighbors for a long time. I taught 3 of his 4 children in school. And years ago, when I was getting ready to teach Genesis that academic year, I was chatting with Michael, get some feedback on some ideas I had. And he had been talking about writing a book on Genesis for many years. And I asked him, so how's it going? And he said, well, I'm done with it, but it's not finished. And so I said, I'll help you finish it. And that became the first of the 5 books. We initially thought it was going to be a one-off project. And as we gave it more thought, we realized that each of the 5 books of the Pentateuch have important real-life lessons for Americans living in the 21st century. In this year 2026, as you said, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And each of the books had a timely message. Genesis, we talked about consensual relationships. We live in a time where people say if I agree to it, it's all good. And there's lots of stories in Genesis where people agreed to stuff and the endings weren't always quite so good. We'll skip over Exodus for a minute. In Leviticus, people often see it as a blueprint for the sacrificial services in the tabernacle, and it's much more than that. It's got important lessons about nation building, which I think is so very important in the times we live. It's very contentious, and we seem to be having challenges, all of us getting along, be we right, be we left, be we centrist. And so we thought our book was timely. Numbers deals with changing leadership style. Moses started off as what we would call sovereign leader. He was king, he was priest, he was everything. And his goal, and we demonstrated this by the end of the sojourn in the desert, he wanted to be sure that the people, they could express themselves, that their voices would be heard and that they would be part of building their future, which is a very American idea. One person, one vote. It's the bedrock of democracy. Our book on Deuteronomy, which is coming out in the next couple months, focuses on the challenges in transition and leadership, which is a real big issue, we think, in America, especially since the Gore-Bush election in 2000. It seems like since then, the system worked great for 200 years, and in the past 25 years, there's been challenges, there's been questions, a lot of debate and discussion. So we think we have what to say on that too. So it's been a wonderful project. Cool. Rabbi Boyd's been a great mentor to me, a great teacher, and it was a privilege to work with him. And so I'm excited to tell you more about our Exodus book.
Well, I found the Exodus book riveting to read, and I'm excited to know that this series is out there because Christians need to have the information and the content, and I don't want to say ammunition and sound like I'm warring, but I mean, I see people all the time in my community and on social media talk, oh, the separation of church and state, oh, religion was never part of our founding, just sort of getting the whole idea of biblical morals and ethics out of public discourse and out of the conversation. I think there's textbooks in our middle schools that have more pages devoted to the 5 pillars of Islam than to the history of Genesis or the 10 Commandments or some of the core tenets of the value system that Christianity then builds on, but the Jewish people certainly cradled and brought to the world, actually.
I'll just Amy, I'll just mention this. I was at the Kufi
Sure.
Summit just the other week, and that was a big theme of the summit. How the Jewish Bible provides not only the underpinnings for the Christian faith, but also for America's core values. We had speaker after speaker there talk about the lessons that can be gleaned from the Jewish Bible. And as we'll talk about, how the Jewish Bible impacted the founders of this country.
Exactly, because I see too many people, even very patriotic and well-meaning people, talk about the foundations of Americans' political system, American government, as being from Athens and Rome. And I'm like, no, Jerusalem. It comes from Jerusalem originally, and then there were iterations of it. So I want to examine this book sort of in order so that when our listeners and viewers go out and buy it, because you all should buy it, it's on Amazon, Finding America and Exodus. You talk about Exodus as being a blueprint for a more perfect union. So what is the influence of this particular book of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, on the American founders? Did they see themselves as sort of a parallel of what the Hebrew people went through when they were trying to get out from under Pharaoh, while the American founders were trying to get out of being under King George?
That's a great question. There's been much written on this topic. Let me just give you a couple very notable examples, I think, that will
Sure.
demonstrate the point. So the first English settlers came to America in the early 1600s. And they clearly likened themselves to Moses and the Jewish people as they were fleeing. And the Pilgrims said it more explicitly. They did see themselves, they talked about themselves in their writings as the new Israelites. They saw themselves reliving the Exodus saga. So, for instance, the Pilgrims first left England for Holland in 1608, and they were describing themselves as the chosen people. They talked about casting off the yoke of a Pharaoh-like ruler, King James. And when they headed out to America a dozen years later from Holland, their leader said that their mission would be as vital as that of Moses and the Israelites when they went out of Egypt. And when they got to the New World, they fell to their knees and they expressed words of gratitude, reenacting the song and the sea of the Jewish people. Even if we fast forward to some of the influential people in the founding of America, one of my favorite examples is Thomas Paine in Common Sense. Common Sense, which was published anonymously, had such a huge impact in rallying the people behind the cause. And he described King George as I'm using his words, quote, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England. And so They saw it that way. We Jews in particular are very familiar with some of Washington's words because he sent a well-known and often quoted letter to members of a congregation, Mikveh Yisrael in Savannah, Georgia. And this is what he wrote. May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivered the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors, planted them in the Promised Land, whose provincial agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven. The best example, I don't have an image of it, but your listeners should Google Benjamin Franklin's proposed symbol for the United States. We're all familiar with the eagle. Franklin proposed the splitting the sea with Moses standing on shore with his staff lifted. So there's countless examples of the influence. They were deeply religious people, even if they weren't always churchgoers. Jefferson was not a churchgoer, but he knew his Hebrew Bible very well, as did Franklin.
Yeah, a lot of people dismiss many of the founders as deists at best, and that's not really true when you actually go back and look at the documentation, the letters, the rhetoric that they were using. God was personal and had a hand in things, and the Hebrew Bible was certainly the core of that reference where they got their faith from. So
I'll tell you for myself, Amy, I have no doubt that the hand of God was behind the founding of America. Because if you look at it, you had this remarkable group of individuals, men and women, who came together in the right place at the right time to form this amazing country where people have so much freedom and so many rights. And all of us are free to practice our religious beliefs, which we take for granted. But there are places around the world where there are Christians who are regularly suppressed or killed for their Christian beliefs. And there are Jews who are harassed for our beliefs. And so America gives us all a safe zone, as it were. And it just can't be coincidental that these people, we all rattle off the names, Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Madison and Hamilton, go on and on and on. They all happen to live at the same time and come together with the same vision, because there'd never been an idea of a democratic republic like America. And we've been in existence for 250 years. Hand of God is certainly on all our collective shoulders.
Exactly. And I think Benjamin Franklin said after they came out and signed, I think it was the Constitution, somebody said, what kind of government did you give us? And his answer was a republic if you can keep it. So that's a lesson also that it's not a one and done deal. So now that we've recognized clearly that the founders and their predecessors, the colonials from the 1600s, saw themselves as escaping the tyranny of whatever European monarch they might have come from, most of them obviously from the UK. They also found lessons in the book of Exodus. So they aligned themselves, putting themselves sort of in a parallel position, and now they're learning the lessons from Exodus. What were some of the lessons the founders found in Exodus and mulled over and then made evident?
Sure. Let me start by saying one of the challenges with this book is that everyone thinks they know the story, whether you're familiar with the Bible or not. The Jews left Egypt, 10 plagues, the sea split, 40 years in the wilderness. And we are retelling it in a sense because the story is not just about liberation of an enslaved people. It's much more than that. So that was the first point. One of the things we set out to do, and it was an interesting intellectual exercise, is looking at how else could the story possibly have been read. In other words, we started with the question, was the Exodus inevitable? In other words, were there other ways to bring, if not freedom, to alleviate the suffering of the Jewish people? One approach might have been, again, if you look closely at the text, and one of the things we did in all our books, frankly, is we look very, very closely at the text itself. We rarely bring in Jewish commentary or oral tradition on the text. We want the words to speak to themselves. So the story could be read as Paro might have been interested in offering the slave citizenship. In other words, if you look by the end of the plagues, by the ninth plague, Pharaoh's relenting says, okay, you can go to the wilderness, you can worship your God, just leave your cattle and your flocks here. You'll come back. And as the Jews were leaving, the Egyptians offered them gold and silver. And it's not so far-fetched. The Jews had been in Egypt for hundreds of years. Some were better positioned. Some had better patrons. Maybe they had some leadership roles in the work forces, but they understood Egyptian civilization. And so the idea that perhaps one way to deal with it, because at the outset, Pharaoh was concerned. Remember, he said, what if they join our enemies? They're very, very numerous. So one way to read it is perhaps Pharaoh wanted to invite them to become citizens. It's a plausible read. Clearly, God was not interested in the Jews being citizens of Egypt. There was a possibility, if you read the text, of rebellion. The rabbinic tradition, it's an interesting word in the text. It says the Jews left Egypt, and forgive me for using a Hebrew word, but we need to use it to make the point. It said they left Egypt chamushim. Now, the word chamushim is related to the Hebrew word for five, chamesh, and so there's a rabbinic tradition that only 1 in 5 of the Jews actually left Egypt. That the 80% of the population died in slavery. One view says that they tried to sneak out during the plague of darkness, and God wasn't ready to have them sneak out. But the other reading of this word, chamushim, it's related to the word being armed. And the commentaries say they left armed. Where they got the weapons, why they had the weapons, did they think they need them when they were in the wilderness? But there's a view that says they had arms while they're in Egypt. And again, Pharaoh said, what if they rise up against us and join their enemies? So the notion that the Jews might rebel was in the back of their mind. And I'll say parenthetically, the southern slave owners, when they wanted to teach their enslaved people about Christianity, they gave them redacted Bibles. They took out the Exodus story because they knew if the slaves read about Moses and the Jewish people leaving Egypt, and we know there's hymnals that the blacks sang at the time about Moses take of the right. But God also wasn't interested in revolution. So the idea behind this is that God understood that the Jews were meant to be, as he says before he gives over the law at Mount Sinai, you should be for me a holy nation and a nation of priests. You can't be a holy nation living in Egypt. Egypt is seen in the Jewish faith tradition as the most impure of civilizations. Not only were they steeped in idolatry, but there was sexual perversion and promiscuity throughout the land. The Jews could not fulfill the role God wanted for them in Egypt, be they co-citizens, be they rulers. So the Exodus was inevitable. God wanted the Jews out. And so that's part of the background. But it's clear that liberty alone, freedom alone wasn't the ultimate end game. And I think this is the most important message those of the founders who were familiar with the book of Exodus would have gotten. Because the simplest proof of this is when the Jews left Egypt, they didn't go straight to the land of Israel. It would have taken a normal caravan, it would take a week or so to go from Canaan to Egypt, right? Hundreds of thousands of people longer. But where did they go first? They spent 7 weeks traveling to Mount Sinai to get the law, So God's plan was clearly, you will be free, but you're going to be free to build a nation that is based on law. And so you'll have a just, law-abiding society. And we think, Rabbi Breuer and myself, that the founders got this, because if you look at our founding documents, it's all based upon how you organize the government and laws. There are very few personal freedoms set out in the Constitution. If you look through it carefully, there's only 3. The freedoms we talk about: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, are all in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And so the founders understood just breaking away from England without a society that's built on laws misses the point. And that's I think the main lesson they got from Exodus.
So I think you call it liberty with a purpose.
Yes, that's how we like to
Right.
think about it.
Yeah. So What does that mean to God? What does that mean to Moses? And what did that mean to early Americans, liberty with a purpose? Because today, if you ask somebody on the street, if you ask a college student, what is liberty? It means I can go do whatever I want. I can go party. I can play video games. Someone should pay for my stuff. And that's what it is. So with that idea of they're out of the oppression, but there's 7 weeks. That's an interesting number too, right? 7 weeks to get the law. Well, wait a minute. We just came out of oppression, liberty. Now what do I need all these laws for? So if you can expand on that idea.
Sure. One of the backdrops to this, I think, is not in the Exodus story, but is actually later in the book of Numbers. Moses leads the people for 40 years. It was his mission in life. It was his goal in life. He longed to cross the Jordan River and enter the Holy Land along with the people. And however we understand this episode in the book of Numbers, where he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock, it's a much discussed narrative in the rabbinic tradition, and we're all not quite sure, even though it says because you hit the rock and speak. Bottom line, God said, sorry, can't cross the river. And as they got close to the border, Moses prayed and begged and pleaded. Part of our oral tradition says he offered up 515 different prayers. And God, not because he's capricious or not because he lacks in mercy, he said, no, because you, the leader Moses, are not above the law. There was a decree issued. The decree was you can't cross the river, and so you can't cross the river. And this, if you fast forward, is a very important point, and I think our founders got this. Jewish kings. Jewish kings were required to always have a Torah scroll with them to show that they were not above the law. In the ancient world, the kings made the law, and they were the law. In the Jewish monarchy, the king was subservient to the law, and he had to follow its rules just like anybody. And so it's such a moving scene. Moshe begging and pleading, plead. And God says, no, I'll take you to the mountaintop. You can look over the river and see the land, but you can't go in there. And so this idea that no one is above the law, and let's talk about our society, not judges, not members of Congress, not even the president is above the law. And that's one of the core values that the founders put into place. It's interesting, especially as a former history teacher, but since the 1960s, scholars have been very concerned about the expanding powers of the presidency. There was a classic book written by Arthur Schlesinger in 1973. He came up with the phrase, he coined the phrase, the imperial presidency. And he was at that time saying, as we become a great world power, and then we became a superpower, the presidency acquired more powers despite what the Constitution put in place. And so there has been, historians will agree with this, and this is not a critique of the current administration or the immediate past. This has been the pattern for 50 years or more. And despite this, even though we have these concerns, nobody, even those who say the imperial presidency is an area of concern, no one would say the president is above the law. And that is very Exodus-like, right? Because they came out. The law is the underpinning to everything. That's what we mean liberty with a purpose, to have a society that's built upon laws, that creates a just society. You know, we think in the American tradition, and I'm going to answer a question before you pose it, but you asked me, and I think this is worth talking about, legal versus right, legal versus moral. And so in American society, today in particular, we think about the law. And so the first question people ask is it legal? The Jewish law system asks a different question. Is it right? So let's back up. The Constitution is a good example. The Constitution doesn't preach. It doesn't give you lessons on, well, if you do this, you'll be virtuous. If you do this, you'll be happy. This is a path to salvation. And it's not because these things are irrelevant. What did Jefferson famously say? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We recognize these as important human values. But the law, at least in the through the American filter and the American framework, is interested in how we maintain a society where We have the liberty to pursue liberty for ourselves and make sure that others can also pursue liberty. They can pursue virtue, happiness, whatever manner in which they choose to do so. There's a structure. And so we ask, is it legal? One example that comes to mind, perhaps, think about states that have no-fault divorce. They don't ask, did you cheat on each other? Did you commit adultery? The law says you're married, and you say, we don't want to be married anymore. It's a legal question, not necessarily a moral question. Right? The Constitution defines what is legal, what is not moral. Now, in Judaism, and this is part of the Exodus story, because the Exodus story doesn't end when they cross the sea. The Exodus story really finally ends with the death of Joshua. The 40 years in the wilderness, the book of Joshua, is a continuation of the Exodus story because, again, the idea is you were freed to set up a nation built on laws, a just, law-abiding society. Joshua was the one who led the people across the Jordan River. Joshua was one who spent 7 years fighting the nations of Canaan to acquire the land. They then spent 7 years dividing up and parceling up the land among the 12 tribes. And only then did you have the end of the story. They were in the land, they can start building law. Judaism has never thought that the law can be uncoupled from religious morality. One of the proof texts we see in the Talmud, which is a compendium of Jewish law, but it's more than that. It's got moral teachings. It's got stories about our founders. We like telling stories. And you tell stories about people, you learn things. So we Americans do too. Did Washington really cut down that cherry tree and say, I cannot tell a lie? Probably not, but it tells you something about his personality, right? So, but the rabbis in the Talmud say, let's look at the flood story. Right? What does God say to Noah after the flood? He says, I now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come. And Judaism's view of this is that this covenant was really the first legal system we had in history because God charged Noah and his descendants with 7 basic quote-unquote laws. They were prohibited from cursing God. They weren't to worship idols. Illicit sexuality was forbidden. Murder was forbidden. Robbery was forbidden. Eating flesh from a living animal was forbidden. These are 7 Noahide laws that we talk about to this day. But God said there's morality there. Adultery is not a legal matter. It's a moral matter, right? And let's take the prohibition, which we see in the utterances that God proclaimed at Mount Sinai. I'll just tell you parenthetically because I always told my students, we call them the 10 Commandments. The Hebrew doesn't say commandments. The Hebrew actually says Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. So what's the practical difference? I'm going to bore your listeners for half a minute. Everyone agrees that there were 10, but in the Jewish count, the first one is the introductory verse that says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. In the Catholic and Protestant versions of the 10 Commandments, that's not counted because there's no commandment. It's a statement. We just talk about 10 utterances, not 10 commandments. So how do you get to 10? So one approach is the prohibition on idolatry. You divide it in 2. You can't worship idols, you can't make idols. The other approach is about coveting. You said you can't covet your neighbor's wife. You can't covet your neighbor's house. So everyone agrees there's 10, okay? But no matter how you count them, whether you think of them as utterances or commandments, there's a prohibition against illicit sexuality, right? The Jewish Bible goes into great depth about who's forbidden to whom. Children to parents, aunts to nephews, on and on and on and on. Okay, they're in nobody's legal code. Right? People hear that and go, "Oh, gross!" But you're not going to arrest somebody if you're committing incest. You shun them, perhaps, but Judaism sees that the law has a moral underpinning, and the strongest indication of this is what I'm going to call a meta commandment. There's certain laws in the Jewish Bible that don't have specific details. They serve as an umbrella to the way we are supposed to live our lives. And one of these meta commands is God says in the book of Deuteronomy, do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. He doesn't define good or right in the book, but doing good and doing right is not a legal issue. And I can argue Stealing is not right, but we don't say it's illegal because it's not right. It's illegal because you took something of mine that you have no legal claim to. And so in the Jewish view of law, the term for it is halakha. Halakha is actually derived from the Hebrew word for path or walking. So Jewish law gives us a path for how to live our lives. It may be the fact that someone can be in a Jewish court prosecuted for breaking the law may be less important than whether the person does the right thing or the wrong thing. And that is part of what it means to build a just society. And so if we all don't break the speed limit and we all pay our income tax on time and the correct amounts, that's great. That's legal. But who takes care of the widow? Who takes care of the orphan? Who ensures that when we give you our word is our bond? Who visits the sick? There's no requirement to establish and support charity funds, but people of faith do. So
right.
people of faith understand that there's the laws of man and the laws of God. One of the books I wrote looked at that and made detailed analysis of the difference between Jewish law and American law. The laws of man are very straightforward, but the laws of God include taking care of the impoverished and the needy and the less fortunate and being honest and speaking kindly to each other and not gossiping and just go on and on and on, which you think that has nothing to do with the law. And in the American framework, that's true. But when we talk about, I think, the type of country we all want to live in, we do want people who are concerned with such things. We want honest people and kind people and charitable people. And we don't pass laws to make them do that. But that's building a just and righteous society. That was what Moses was commanded. And I think the founders intuited this. They understood that your job was to build the legal framework so the country could exist and function. And they thought, I believe, that that most of the people they dealt with were good people. I would go so far as to call them God-fearing people. Not everybody. Um,
Not everybody.
and right, but I think they saw that, and I think they wanted it. Think about when we talk about the framework. We didn't have the Constitution in 1776. It was only ratified in 1789. So the country existed for 13 years under something called the Articles of Confederation. And it was a mess. There were essentially 13 mini states with their own laws and their own currencies and their own standing armies. It was a mess. It was only when Madison and Hamilton and John Jay went to Mount Vernon. There was a fourth one who was involved, and I'm forgetting who it is. There's a wonderful book written about this called The Quartet. They went to Mount Vernon and said, General Washington, we know you retired, but your legacy is falling apart, and we need a constitution. And the only way we can get it passed is if you unretire and you step up to be the first president. They knew this going into it, and in their back pocket, they knew that we can create a constitution and give the legal underpinnings that have made America so great to this day, only if Washington says, once again, he steps up. This is a man who didn't want to be president. This man had an incredible notion of serving his country, and we should all be thankful that he stepped up.
I think God probably nudged him too. So what I see you saying here, and what I think the book is also relaying, is the lessons are that God really gives the law, the moral law, and by exegesis you can carve out a legal system. Men can derive laws from the moral law, but that the king or the leadership is not above it or outside of that framework, but also all of the citizens, all of the people, including the leadership, their liberty is to be able to buy in and say, yes, we are also part of that moral and legal law. And that reminds me, and I forget which founding father said it, maybe you know, it might have been George Washington, or it might have been Thomas Jefferson, but it was basically something like, can't do this American experiment without a faithful or religious people, without a people that is bound to the moral law first. And I wish I knew that quote off the top of my head. So we've
But let me
established
just
that.
let me make this observation because I think you made a very good point. Let's think about for a minute the former Soviet Union. They had lots of laws. Wasn't a just society. I mean, there are countries today. North Korea certainly has lots of laws, but it's not a just society. It's people are impoverished. They're not well. They have no freedom. The enduring lesson of Exodus, the law alone is not enough because a cold, calculating approach to is it legal? It's a necessary question to ask. But if that's the only question you ask, I believe you're hard pressed to have a just society.
Mhm.
And that's
Right.
when God says you're to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. That was the introduction to the Ten Commandments. That was the preamble. This is your mission to be a holy nation. Um, the notion of chosenness is misunderstood. The Jewish people and the notion of chosenness, not we're better. We were chosen to be role models. You know, in our
Yep.
faith tradition, everyone is commanded to worship the one true God. And I say this when I work as a chaplain, and I'm often asked to pray with and for people of all faiths. And I say to them, we use perhaps different words and different rituals, but our words end up in the same place. We all believe in the same God. Um, and you can't be just if the law stands alone. There needs to be moral underpinnings to make a just society. And history has shown you've had many law-abiding uh, kingdoms, empires. We talk about the Roman Empire. They were moral degenerates, right? Anyway, I'd cut you off. You had one more question, I think.
Oh, well, what I was thinking about when we were kind of working through that progression of the underpinning is the moral law, um, and that the citizenry has to have that in order to even function inside the legal framework. It reminds me of a paper I did back in high school about secondhand smoke, where I said, and I didn't coin this, but I said, your right to smoke ends where my nose begins. That idea of
Correct.
I can pursue my happiness until it impedes your pursuit, right? So that's sort of where the legalese comes in. So I wanted to ask you, what is the balance between liberty for an individual? And you mentioned that the Bill of Rights only really gives us a few. And then the individual's use of liberty for being responsible for the community or for something outside themselves. And how does that look in Exodus? How does that look in Judaism, and compare that to what you think the founders were thinking and what we think today?
That's such an important question, and I have to tell you, we thought about this question a lot while we were looking on the book, and we asked ourselves, what can we really say? What can we say with confidence about the American perspective on freedom and liberty? And so, um, we had a couple of thoughts on this topic. First of all, and I think it's important to sit out there. Um, we as a people, we Americans as a people, are consistently aspirational in our national declarations. Right? Jefferson says we hold these truths to be self-evident. The goal of the preamble to the Constitution to form a more perfect union. Lincoln's words at Gettysburg: "A government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Um, but the reality is, we don't always live up to these aspirations. And I'm just going to say this also as an aside. Um, when Donald Trump emerged on the American political scene and started talking about make America great again, I laughed because I never saw America as not being great. To me, America has always been great, and our greatness is this aspirational aspect. In my synagogue, we actually had a three-part series on the Declaration of Independence and how it impacts us as Jews and what role Jews might have played in it. And one of the speakers in the lecture talked about this phrase, all men are created equal. And people say, really? Jefferson, you owned slaves. Did you really mean all men are created equal? Some will argue what he meant was, well, if you were male and you were white and you were a property owner, um, she argued, and I think convincingly, that this was an aspirational statement. Jefferson understood we weren't there yet, but America wants to evolve to a point, and we keep moving forward. We recognize the missteps, and not to recognize the missteps in our history does us a disservice. Slavery was a terrible blight on our historical record. Genocidal war in the late 1800s against the Native American population, arresting Japanese American citizens, putting them in internment camps in World War II. These are terrible things. Individuals do terrible things too, but we encourage them to repent, turn over a new leaf, whatever term you want. And we recognize that people can learn from their mistakes. And I believe America does. And this aspirational nature is so important because there's always a subset of Americans. Sometimes it's very, very large. Sometimes it's smaller. But this subset is always pushing to make us a better country. They embrace the aspirational nature of what the American vision represents. And we see it in my lifetime. And I'm 68. In my lifetime, I've seen increased women's rights, civil rights, social justice, economic rights. Right? There's things we're pushing forward. That was one thing when we talked about Americans view of freedom and liberty. Now, the other thing, and this is, you've touched on it, and it's important to say this, we Americans tend to emphasize the rights and the freedoms of the individual. That's what the Bill of Rights is all about. It's about individual rights, individual freedoms. It's true for the lobbyists and the activists who are up in Washington, whether they're from the NRA, whether they're from Black Lives Matters. And just as you said, look at the language you hear over and over. My right to bear arms, my right to choose to have an abortion, my right to marry the person I choose, my right to post or tweet whatever message or speech I want, even during COVID, my right not to wear a mask and not to get a vaccine. We talk about my rights, my rights. And this made us think about, you and I discussed this leading up to this podcast. John Kennedy famously said in his inauguration, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I don't think any politician in America could say that today. I think the masses want to say, ask not what I can do for my country, ask what my country can do for me. And I think it's a longer discussion perhaps, but I think that's problematic. Now, the Jewish view, we're talking about a contrast on how we view freedom and liberty. The Jewish view is the individual is not free from responsibility or not free from his or her responsibility vis-a-vis the community. For a Jew, freedom encompasses commitment and devotion to God, to the study of his law, to the Jewish people, which could be a very, very broad picture. It could be your community. But these are, we believe, and they're presumed that they can only exist where you have a strong commitment to the law, because the law makes this possible. The law keeps us safe. The law keeps us functioning. The law keeps us order. So when you have that safety and you have that sense of order, I can focus on my responsibility to the other. And I think that's one of the biggest difference between the American legal framework and the Jewish legal framework, because when you keep asking, is it legal? I can start focusing on what I want. When you got a moral component, and I think your statement, you didn't mean it as a moral component, but is, my right to smoke ends where your right to breathe begins, right? I can't impose. So that's an important difference. It's hard to know. I like to think that founders appreciated this difference. I don't know if they did. I don't know that we have evolved as a country in a way that still appreciates the difference. I think, and this is part of the goal of our meta project of writing all 5 books, we think we live in times where people need to be stepping back and reflecting on these sort of questions. Where we stop being so divisive. We stop saying, well, if you disagree with me, that means not only that you're wrong, it means you're dumb and you're evil. And when if you get that sort of, I don't even have a word for it, but if you have that sort of attitude, that sort of harshness, it's hard to not then be empathetic for the other and think I have a responsibility for the other. You know, they're MAGA and I hate them. They're social democrats and I hate them.
Yeah, it's
No, we're
that
all
cancel culture, right? It's
Yes.
like just canceling.
Right.
There's an
And I think,
interesting phenomenon. I don't know if you've encountered it yet, but this whole idea of canceling and vilifying the person who disagrees with you about some political issue or even a moral issue for that matter is it's invading families. So there's this movement among young people that if you disagree with your parents or they disagree with you, that you're supposed to like just cut them out of your life.
Yeah.
And to me, that violates the first thing I thought when I heard about this phenomena is the utterance of honor your mother and father, because I always took that to mean that you didn't have to agree with your parents on every single thing out there, but honoring them is different than agreeing with them. I mean, I'm way off topic now, but that's just an illustration of how that canceling thing is sort of seeping in at the familial level.
Yes, absolutely. I think it reinforces your point. The statistics I heard not so long ago that among men aged 30 or younger in this country, less than 1 out of 3 say they have one close friend. A third of the young men in this country have no friend.
That's really sad.
You can't build a just moral society when you're so isolated. When you talk about this notion of seeing in the other, there's a beautiful lesson. One of the great Hasidic masters said his view was when you start finding faults in others, the reality is the others is serving as a mirror and then reflecting back to you your own faults. So I think as a country, if we don't need to be less legal. We need to be less legal only, right? The law is
Right.
important, but the law is not everything. And
Right. The spirit, the moral beneath it, the morals upon which we built our laws, we got to start there. So Rabbi Travis, let me just ask you one final thought, or to give us your final thoughts on this idea. There's more to your book that I'd love to discuss at other times, but would you say that Moses, Joshua for that matter, and our founding fathers, when they set up the Constitution, after the 13 years of sort of chaos after winning the revolution, was there always this idea of we're going to look at the bar, and you and I are going to say it's God's bar, right? It's the moral law, it's what we aspire to. And we're just, whether it's our personal life or a whole country, that we incrementally keep reaching for it. It's not like we start tomorrow. Joshua didn't get in the land and say, okay, today it's done. We're here. We're all perfect. Everybody be nice to each other. And we didn't do that the day after the Constitution was ratified. So what's your final thoughts on the idea of it's a process?
Judaism very much sees it as a process, I think. The verse I quoted to you, where God commands that which is good and right in the eyes of the Lord. One of the understandings of this verse is that it is commanding us to go beyond the letter of the law, which is a very, very interesting idea. The legal answer is not always the good and the right answer. And you see this, Jewish communities are just built on this social network. There's charity funds. There's a Hebrew word they call it gemach. So gemach started in Europe, and you have them in Orthodox Jewish communities across this country. Woman's getting married. She can't afford a nice wedding dress. There's a gemach. You can go pick wedding dresses. We have, in my neighborhood, we have a chair gemach. So I'm having a function. I need folding chairs. So I can go to this one house. He must have 100 folding chairs in a storage closet. I can borrow as many folding chairs as I want. And there's all sorts of societies to help people out. And they brought that from the old world to America. Many of the founders of the American labor union were Jews from Europe. The Jewish unions were often 20, 30, 40 years ahead of the non-Jewish counterparts in putting in worker safety issues, because they understood a sense of community and helping out and looking to the future. It's not enough that, I'll use an example, I want to get a 50-cent an hour raise for my workers. I want to limit how many hours they work. I want to look to the future. And so I think it is. I'll give you a biblical image for this. And I think it could and should work for America as well as the Jewish people. Jacob had that amazing dream with angels going up and down the ladder. And our understanding of the dream is, if you're not going up, you're automatically going down. And so the ladder was there to teach us is because its feet rested on the ground and the top of the ladder reached to the heavens. And the goal is to ascend that ladder. So we always look to better ourselves, to better our communities. We think part of humankind's mission is to make the world a better place. We should all think about how do I leave things better than when I got them. Think of the parable that's in so many cultures, planting trees. One of the versions is some people came to a field and there's an old man planting an orchard. They're like, "You're a fool. You won't live long enough to see the fruit." He said, "No, but my children and grandchildren will." And I think that's the type of attitude Judaism has. I think America has that attitude. I think, forgive me for getting political, but I think some of our political leaders don't have this attitude. I think they focus too much on winning the next election and not thinking about how do I build the country up? How do I take the country to the next level? As opposed to how do I win the next primary? And that's
Exactly.
right. That's a different issue, but the founders were also aware. Remember, the people who founded this country were not full-time politicians. When they served the session count, they went back to their farms or their businesses or whatever they did because they had lives. And they served sometimes as lawmakers, and then they had lives. And when you live that type of existence, where you're a part-time lawmaker, you understand the importance of making sure the life part of your life is doing well and moving forward. So,
Absolutely. 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 Rabbi Travis, I just treasure your wisdom, and I'm so glad we're going to have you back and we're going to discuss more of your books. But everybody, I want you to go to Amazon.com, Finding America in Exodus by Michael J. Broyd and Reuven Travis. It is not that long of a book. It's a good read. Their writing is precise and conversational and easy to understand. It's a great book club book as well, and you can be armed with ideas to bring to your community, your network, your family, your workplace, your Bible study, and just really reinforce and encourage people to aspire to God's word as the foundation of how we live our own lives, but also how we vote and how we influence policy in a democratic republic. Rabbi Travis, thank you so much. I can't wait till we meet again.
thank you. I very much look forward to it.
Wonderful. Shavua Tov.
Same to you.
If you enjoy these conversations, please visit us at www.thejerusalemconnection.us. Find all our podcasts on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast program. Follow us on social media, subscribe, like, and share our content to reach the broadest audience.